brothers and sisters. Robert D. Putnam argues in his essay from 1995, Bowling Alone, the collapse and revival of American community, that there is a decrease in social capital in America since 1950. In his survey, he finds a decrease in membership of traditional civic organizations and a disengagement from political involvement and volunteering. At the same time, there is an increase, Putnam argues, of membership in mass membership organizations that does not require personal involvement. Furthermore, he argues that the main reason for this seems to be the technological development that has led to an increased individualization in leisure time and the creation of, quote, virtual reality helmets, unquote. More recent research leads us to a more complicated picture. First of all, Putnam's research depends on his particular definition of social capital, defined as the increase of a general will to do things for each other. Putnam's definition makes it more or less self-evident that virtual communication and digital media decrease the social capital, and he seems to forget that virtual communities are communities in their own right, but different. Still, Putnam's definition is most useful for ecclesiological research, since most of the church communities would substantiate Putnam's definition of social capital and would argue that social capital for an ecclesiastical context has to involve face-to-face actions, which is a necessary consequence of Putnam's definition. Secondly, later research also gives us a more differentiated picture of how virtual communication affects social capital. Putnam is right in his observation that social capital may decrease with the use of virtual communication, but mainly when it is detached from a physical community. If we instead look on virtual communication that is attached to a physical community, we find different numbers and an increase in social capital using Putnam's definition. My main question for today is to explore the reasons why we have a difference between virtual communications detached versus attached to a physical community. I will make this analysis in 3 steps. First, I will try to find the reasons from the perspective of social theory and make use of Jürgen Habermas' theory of communicative action, with this differentiation between ritual action and communicative action. In the second step, I will take a philosophical, theological perspective and take my departure in Heidegger's ontological difference. Finally, in the third step, I will make some recommendations in relation to pastoral approach to internet and the use of digital media. 1. From a perspective of social theory, the differentiation between communicative action and ritual action. Jürgen Habermas dominated the scene within the field of social theory and communications in the 80s and 90s. His philosophy gravitates on the human conditions, arguing for a shift from a philosophy of consciousness to a philosophy of language, the so-called Habermasian shift. Too fast. The so-called Habermasian shift. His understanding of a human being is intersubjective, in the sense that humans establish their understanding of reality through dialogue with other human beings, and not through an individual monologue of thinking as a classical theory of a subject proposes. From his intersubjective understanding of reality, he develops an understanding of emancipation that resides in the community rather than with the individual, but where the individual is set free through communicative action. Communicative action was more or less seen by Habermas as opposite ritual action, which was established in religious symbolism instead of language. Because of its dependence on symbolism, ritual action carries with it an irrational understanding of the world, Habermas argued, which, quote, confuses internal relations of meaning with external relations among things and validity with empirical efficiency, unquote. This in turn has the effect that the individual human being becomes suppressed. But with the progression of communicative action, dialogue and mutual understanding become possible, which Habermas believed would make ritual action fade away. The first step in the evolvement of communicative action, Habermas argued, is a differentiation between the two. There's been a lot of critique against Habermas among religious scholars, since his critique of ritual action strikes the very existence of religious life. Anyways, I consider the differentiation between communicative action and ritual action as a lasting contribution, but it nevertheless makes 2 egregious errors. My first argument, in line with David Scheel and others, is that Habermas based his understanding on misconception of rituals. I agree with Habermas that rational communication through ritual is limited, and can be used for sustaining an irrational worldview and suppress its participators. But the main purpose is not the proliferation of rationalization. Instead, ritual action is intended to construct the social world through solidarity and relations. Rituals articulates intersubjective frames in the way that objects are socially defined, and thereby express a subjective experience of being in the same life world. In that way, ritual practice is beyond truth and falsity. The second follows from the first. It is not ritual action per se that is the problem. Instead, I argue that the problem is that ritual action and community action are not differentiated enough. If this is the case, in exact, not differentiated enough, then ritual action in the forms of myths, ritual practices, and narratives are disguised as irrefutable facts. If they instead are differentiated enough, ritual practice takes on its correct form beyond truth and falsity and instead reveals the common life world of a community and aligns communicative action without replacing it. From these two arguments, we may interpret the evolution of a society in a different way than Habermas. In the pre-modern society, ritual action and communicative action were enmeshed in such a way that internal relations of meaning were confused with external relations among things and events, and empirical efficiency was confused with validity. With social evolution, ritual action and communicative action are differentiated in the sense that they are different. Ritual action producing social solidarity beyond rational discourse could best be exemplified in the act of Mary of Bethany, John 12, 1-8. Mary of Bethany washes the feet of Christ, and Jude is standing at the side of her, questioning the purpose of her act. What good comes from this act? Why couldn't she have given the money to the poor instead? Yes, what is the purpose of her act? What is the purpose of weeping, praying, and extending such a love? The answer is simply that there is no outer purpose greater than loving God and our fellow human being. When every righteous act has been fulfilled, every agreement has been finalized, the act of Mary remains, and everything else fades away. That is ritual action beyond words that reveals a basic solidarity that cannot be substituted by any rational discourse or communicative action. From these two modes of actions, wherein the community exists, we gain some explanatory power in understanding the success in increasing the social capital through internet and digital media. When virtual communication is attached to a physical community, the differentiation between ritual action and communicative action is made easier. Then participants in the virtual community use virtual communication for reaching mutual understanding with a direction toward consensus. When we instead have a detached virtual community, internet and digital media not only suffers for mutual understanding and consensus, but is also used to fulfill the participants' existential needs, which is beyond rational discourse. Arguments and opinions therefore take on an irrational mode where rational arguments are replaced by authority and obedience, which makes the participant passive in the physical reality or make the radical differentiation between the digital world and the physical world. 2, the philosophical-theological perspective, the ontological difference. Martin Heidegger was the most controversial figure in many aspects. He was associated with the Nazi party and was deemed a Mitläufer, follower after the war. At the same time, he had his own followers, among them several Jews. Habermas nevertheless closely associated Heidegger's thinking with the totalitarian regime of the Nazis and therefore criticized him vehemently. Notwithstanding some aspects of a critique, Heidegger made the most important differentiation. Heidegger made the difference between das Sein, being with a capital B, and das Seiende, being with a minor b, and coined the expression Seinsvergessenheit as the act of forgetting this difference. In classical metaphysics, the human being was seen as an essence with the center. But in his major opus Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, he reopens the question of a human being. There he understands the human being as essentially a presence in time, and not merely as an essence. Substance does not depend on time, Heidegger argued, but this is precisely the case with beings. This is evident, Heidegger continued, since we do not only relate to other beings as presence, but also as absence in a continuum of time, which makes it obvious that beings exist in time and not merely as essences. The time continuum of beings reveals yet another decisive element in our understanding of being, the ontological difference. It is the appearance of beings in time, das Seiende, and not being thus sign in itself, it brings to effect our awareness of being. Classical metaphysics is caught in a forgottenness of being, Seinsvergessenheit, Heidegger argued. The ontological difference makes it possible for Heidegger to move from a self-enclosed subject to a human being endowed with a relation to existence as such. This in turn makes it possible for human beings to transcend themselves. Human being, Dasein, Heidegger continues, takes place in ecstatic relatedness to being, Dasein, for which he used the term existence. It is through this existential relatedness that human beings become aware of a reality, which makes the entire reality filled with relatedness, which makes reality slip away from any closed definition. These also have an explanatory power in relation to the success of social capital in relation to attached virtual communications. Relations are simply more than mere words. This is why virtual communications tries to copy face-to-face communication as much as possible. But with the closer tie to face-to-face communication, the risk of establishing a forgottenness of being is heightened. This was also the reason why Heidegger was highly critical toward the theology of being, which has evolved in the recent decades. Wayne G. Hankey has analyzed Heidegger's critique of the theology of being, which Heidegger understood as a Seinsvergessenheit within theology. In order to avoid Heidegger's critique, Hankey argues, we have to make two necessary theological differences. The first is the difference between ontology and revelation. Ontology belongs to the realm of what is, and revelation belongs to the realm of what ought to be. Revelation resides within a community of those sharing the revelation and belongs to the communicative capacity the human beings have for reaching mutual understanding. This makes being in the world linguistic and referring back to Habermas based on communicative action. With divine revelation constituting the cultural background of a life work, but involving the human being as a subject, as Acts 15:28 sheds light upon, quote, it seemed good to us, to the Holy Spirit and to us, unquote. Ontology instead depends on existential relatedness beyond words, which enlightens our existence but cannot be explained, only proclaimed, in the same way as love cannot be explained without losing its quintessence. The second difference is between being and thought. Thinking about being is not being. Metaphysical constructions do not reveal the authenticity of a God whom we worship and direct our prayers to. Instead, we need to move beyond not just philosophy, but also theoria toward poiesis and praxis, where praxis are the shared practices of a church, and poiesis are the creative experiences of charity. Otherwise, we would still be entangled in the confusion of beings with being. And only through poiesis and praxis can the love of God be manifested in the world, and dialogue lead to doxology. In relation to virtual communication, the ontological difference makes us aware of a difference between the virtual community, which is only a typos for the full existential reality of a physical community, archetypos. If you want virtual communication to be successful from existential relatedness, it is important that we are not caught in an ontological forgottenness. To avoid this forgottenness, we have to differentiate between the existential reality that is based on the proclamation of our common awareness beyond words and the linguistic reality that is captured in words that leads to dialogue and mutual understanding. Once we are caught in this ontological forgottenness, communication becomes distorted. On one hand, themes that should be discussed and elaborated through dialogue and mutual understanding quickly become absolute truths, and we forget that even these truths were once discussed and vindicated. On the other hand, the mystery of God is defined by words, but we forget that these can never capture the essence of God. Finally, a pastoral approach, recommendations in relation to internet and the use of digital media. The twofold differentiation by Habermas and Heidegger gives us a dialectic of virtual communication for a set of pastoral recommendations. Pastoral practice has two dimensions. One dimension takes its departure in the existential reality proclaimed as ritual action. Following an Eastern Christian understanding, the existential relationship is declared in the mystery of the Eucharist, which is beyond definition, but regardless shared in love by the members of Ecclesia, in exact those called to constitute the Eucharistic assembly. The ministry of a priest in this regard is to lead the community into the mystery, leaving all our definitions, anxieties, and thoughts behind. In this dimension, the authority of Christ is revealed as loving, caring, and healing. The second dimension begins after the liturgy as liturgy after the liturgy. Here the mystery opens up as a set of questions, breaking the mystery apart with an invitation to understand, grasp, apprehend, and reason about the mystery. But it has to be rooted in humility that we bring with us from a Eucharist. If these two dimensions are mixed or not differentiated enough, the Eucharist ceases to be an end in itself, in exact the proclamation of the loving Christ as the act of Mary of Bethany, and instead becomes instrumental for proclaiming the hierarchy or gathering money for the benefit of something worthy and good, or less good. In the end, participants become the objects of their own service, alienated to their own work, and joins Jude in his critique of Mary. In the same manner, we will find that the liturgy after the liturgy ceased to exist. Theology is detached from the people and transformed into obedience without understanding, and in the long run, Christ becomes an authority, pride of his own words. But I have called you friends.